Nobody asked how you were doing, not once, not when it mattered. They handed you rules you never agreed to, smiled at your compliance, and called it civilization. They dressed your silence up as patience, your tolerance as virtue, your pain as character building, and you believed them. Because what else do you do when the whole world agrees on a story and you're the only one who notices it doesn't add up? You swallowed it, all of it, the rejection, the humiliation, the doors that closed a little too quietly, so nobody had to feel guilty about closing them. You kept showing up, you kept trying, you kept shrinking yourself into shapes that would finally make them comfortable. It didn't work, did it? Because here's what they never told you, what they couldn't afford to tell you. A person who has nothing left to lose, is not broken. A person who has been pushed to the very edge of what a human being can endure. Is not weak. That person is awake, and an awake person? That's the only thing this world has ever truly been afraid of. Nobody builds a cage and tells you it's a cage. That's not how it works. That's never how it worked. They build it slowly, carefully, with things that look like love, like structure, like opportunity. They hand you a curriculum and call it education. They hand you a schedule and call it discipline. They hand you a role, son, student, employee, citizen, and they say, "This is who you are now." And you take it because you're young and you're hungry for belonging, and belonging feels like survival when you're small and the world is loud. But belonging always had a price, didn't it? Be agreeable, be predictable. Don't ask questions that make people shift in their seats. Don't want too loudly. Don't feel too loudly. Make yourself easy to understand, easy to manage, easy to dismiss. And, in return, we'll let you sit at the table. We'll let you feel, for a little while, like you're one of us. So you paid it. And every morning you woke up and performed the version of yourself they could tolerate. You filed down your edges. You swallowed the things you actually wanted to say. You watched people with half your hunger and twice your connections climb past you, and you nodded, because what else could you do? You had already agreed to the terms. You had already signed something you never actually read, and the worst part? You were good at it. That's what nobody talks about. The ones they need to control most are always the ones with the most to offer. Because mediocrity doesn't need managing. Mediocrity stays in its lane naturally. It has no reason to leave. But you, someone with actual fire in them, actual vision, actual capacity to look at a broken thing and see exactly how it's broken, you are dangerous. Not because you're violent, not because you're unstable, but because you see, okay? And a person who sees cannot be managed forever. So they worked on that, quietly, consistently. Your vision with doubt. They introduced you to your own insignificance early. Through teachers who overlooked you, systems that processed you, people who looked right through you in rooms where you should have mattered. They taught you that your instincts were arrogance, that your frustration was immaturity, that wanting more than what they offered was somehow a character flaw, something to be ashamed of, something to fix. They made you a stranger to yourself, and a person who doesn't know themselves, who has been taught to distrust their own mind, their own instincts, their own rage. That person is easy. They go where they're pointed. They work the hours they're given. They consume what they're sold and vote how they're nudged and die with a version of their life that was always someone else's idea of acceptable. That was the plan for you, not spoken, never spoken, but present in every structure you were handed, in every opportunity that came with invisible conditions, in every relationship where love was a reward for compliance and withdrawal was the punishment for inconvenience. They needed you to stay useful without becoming powerful, stay present without becoming aware, stay functioning because a functioning person asks fewer questions than a broken one. They needed you manageable. Not because you were a threat yet, but because they could see somewhere in the calculus of how systems protect themselves, that if you were ever left alone long enough to think, if you were ever given silence instead of noise, if you ever stopped running long enough to actually look at the life they had constructed around you and ask whether you ever chose any of it, you would become something they had no protocol for. Not angry, not reckless, something far more difficult to contain than that. You would become deliberate. And a deliberate person who has seen the machinery clearly, who has felt every gear of it press into their skin, doesn't swing wildly. Okay? They move with the kind of quiet, absolute intention that systems were never designed to survive. Nobody tells you that suffering has a syllabus. Kent, nobody sits you down and explains that every humiliation you're about to endure, every door that's about to close in your face, every night you spend staring at a ceiling, wondering what is fundamentally wrong with you, that all of it is actually instruction, that the universe, or fate, or whatever indifferent machinery runs this place, has enrolled you in something without your consent, without your knowledge, without even the basic courtesy of telling you when the exam is. You just start bleeding, and you're expected to figure out the rest, and you did bleed. Don't pretend otherwise. Yeah. There were moments that didn't just hurt, they restructured you. Moments where something you believed about yourself, about people, about how the world was supposed to work, got picked up and smashed against the floor so completely that you spent weeks trying to find all the pieces. People you trusted who turned out to be performing trust. Efforts you made that disappeared into silence. Versions of yourself you offered, genuinely, vulnerably, completely, that got handed back to you like something unwanted, like something that didn't quite meet the standard. You felt that in places you didn't even know you could feel things. And here is where most people make the trade. Here is where the system collects what it came for. Because pain at that volume, sustained over enough time, does one of two things to a person. It either opens them, cracks them wide enough that something true finally gets in, or it closes them, seals them off, turns them into someone who has learned through pure repetition that hoping is just the setup for a specific kind of devastation. Most people close. It's not weakness. Don't misread that. It's intelligence of a certain kind. The intelligence of a nervous system that has been burned enough times to develop a healthy relationship with fire. You stop reaching. You build a smaller life, a safer life, a life with low enough ceilings that disappointment can't get the velocity it needs to really destroy you. And you call it realism. You call it maturity. You wear it like it was a choice. It can, but you know it wasn't a choice. You know exactly when it happened. The difference, the only difference that has ever mattered, is what you did with the wreckage. Because pain is not the lesson. Pain is just the medium. The lesson is what you extract from it when you're finally willing to sit with it long enough to stop flinching. When you stop trying to fast forward through the worst parts of your own story and actually look at what they're showing you about people, about which structures in your life were ever actually built for you and which ones were built around you to keep you producing and compliant and grateful for just enough. That is expensive knowledge. Nobody gets it from a book. Nobody gets it from a lecture or a mentor or a carefully curated series of comfortable experiences. You get it from the specific education of being underestimated, of being discarded, of working in rooms that were never going to reward you, and staying in dynamics that were slowly draining something fundamental from you, and surviving anyway, not elegantly, not with your dignity perfectly intact, but surviving, carrying it, processing it in the dark when no one was watching. That process was never meant for them. They didn't orchestrate your low points so that you could eventually stand somewhere and speak with the kind of authority that only comes from someone who has actually been through the fire rather than read about it from a safe distance. They weren't thinking about your development when they overlooked you, when they underpaid you, when they smiled at your face and undermined you with their next breath. They were thinking about themselves. They were always thinking about something, but what they set in motion, without knowing it, without intending it, without any interest in the outcome, was the most rigorous education a person can receive. They paid for it. You earned it. And everything they taught you, every scar that came with a lesson buried inside it, every moment that broke you open instead of just breaking you, that belongs to you now, completely, in a way that nothing they could have willingly given you ever would. They never feared your tears. Not once. Not even when you were at your lowest, when you were coming apart in ways you couldn't hide, when the weight of everything you were carrying finally showed on your face and in your posture and in the way you stopped laughing at things that used to make you laugh. They watched all of that with something close to comfort. Because a person in pain is a person who is occupied. A person drowning in their own emotions is a person who isn't looking around, isn't asking questions, isn't tracing the outline of the architecture that put them in that position in the first place. Yet anger, they could manage too. Anger is loud. Anger is visible. Anger makes a person easy to label, easy to dismiss, easy to point at when you need to explain to an audience why someone's grievance doesn't deserve to be taken seriously. Look at them. Look at how they're behaving. The anger becomes the story. The anger becomes the reason nothing they're saying counts. They have spent centuries perfecting that particular maneuver, provoking the reaction and then using the reaction as evidence that the person reacting was always the problem. Yeah, they are very good at that. But clarity is something else entirely. Clarity doesn't raise its voice. Clarity doesn't need to. It sits very still, and it looks, and it understands, not with the hot, blinding understanding of someone who just got hurt, but with the cold, structural understanding of someone who has followed the logic all the way back to its origin and seen exactly where it started and exactly who it serves and exactly why things are arranged the way they are rather than any of the 1,000 other ways they could have been arranged. That kind of understanding doesn't make noise. And silence, that kind of silence, the silence of a person who has stopped being confused and started being certain, is the only thing that has ever made them genuinely uncomfortable. Again, because noise, they have responses for. They have systems for managing noise. Protests get permitted and routed and contained. Rage gets medicated or incarcerated. or rebrand it into something marketable. Grief gets a timeline and then a gentle suggestion that perhaps it's time to move forward. Every form of emotional expression you could produce has already been studied, cataloged, and assigned a management strategy. Okay? But a person who has simply understood, who has looked at the thing clearly enough to see that the confusion was always manufactured, that the complexity was all, that the reason nothing ever quite made sense was not because but because certain people have a profound investment in you never quite being able to see it. That person cannot be talked out of what they know. You can't gaslight someone back into confusion once they've achieved clarity. You can't reintroduce fog into a mind that has already seen the view from above the clouds. You can offer them alternative explanations, and they'll listen politely, and they'll nod at the right moments, and then they'll return to what they actually know with the quiet, immovable certainty of someone who has done the work and is no longer available to be confused by people who need them confused. And here is the thing about clarity that they really cannot stomach. It's contagious. Okay? One person who sees clearly, who speaks from that seeing rather than from their wound, who presents not a scream but a map, that person changes rooms, not by force, not by volume, but by the simple, devastating act of making things visible that were designed to stay hidden, of saying the true thing in the plain way, without decoration, without apology, without the trembling performance of someone who still needs permission to believe what they already know. That is what rewrites the story, not the anger. The anger was always manageable. The anger was practically useful to them, a release valve, a distraction, a way of keeping the pressure from ever building into something coherent. What is not manageable, what has never been manageable, what every structure of control since the beginning of organized power has been fundamentally designed to prevent, is a person who has stopped being afraid of what they understand. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from performing wholeness, not the tiredness of hard work, not the honest fatigue of someone who has spent themselves on something real and meaningful and can at least point to what they built with all that effort. This is something different. This is specific, bone-deep depletion of someone who has spent years maintaining a version of themselves that was never quite true, smiling at the right moments, laughing on cue, producing the expected responses to the expected situations, showing up as the version of themselves that kept the peace and kept the room comfortable and kept everyone around them from having to deal with anything inconvenient. You know exactly what that feels like because you did it well. You were exceptional at it. And that's the cruelest part of the whole arrangement. The people who are most gifted at nodding, performing stability, are almost always the ones who need it least performed and most felt. And you had the emotional intelligence to read every room you walked into. You knew what was needed before it was asked. You adjusted, you accommodated. You absorbed the tension of other people's discomfort and quietly processed it so that the surface of things remained smooth and everyone could continue pretending that everything was fine. And nobody asked what it cost you. Not once did someone pull you aside and say, "I see what you're doing. I see how much of yourself you're managing right now. I see that the version of you in this room is a performance, and I want to know the person who goes home afterward and takes it all off and sits alone with everything they couldn't say today." Nobody asked because nobody wanted to know, because knowing would have made them responsible. Knowing would have meant they had to reckon with the fact that your availability, your steadiness, your perpetual emotional generosity, none of it was free. It all came from somewhere. It all cost something. And the bill was being paid quietly, internally, in private moments of a kind of grief that doesn't have a clean name, because it's not the grief of losing something external. Okay? It's the grief of losing yourself in installments, small surrenders, each one seeming reasonable in the moment. You don't bring that up because it'll start something. You don't pursue that because it's not practical. You don't say that true thing because the timing isn't right and it'll make them uncomfortable, and you've already calculated the social cost and decided it's too high. Each individual compromise makes sense. Each one is defensible, but compound them over months, over years, over a whole architecture of a life built around managing other people's comfort. And one day you look up and realize you are living at a significant distance from anything you actually are. And the world calls that maturity. They reward it. Even they promote the people who have learned to want only what is on offer. They celebrate the ones who have successfully converted their wildness into productivity, their depth into pleasantness, their complexity into a clean professional surface that causes no friction and asks for nothing inconvenient. The system has no language in that conversion because the system was specifically designed to make that conversion feel like gain. But your body knew. Your body kept the score, even when your mind was busy rationalizing. It knew in the sleeplessness, in the strange hollow feeling after days that looked, on paper, completely fine, in the flashes of something close to rage that came from nowhere, or seemed to come from nowhere until you traced them back to their actual source, which was not any single incident, but the accumulated weight of years of not being fully, honestly, uncomplicatedly yourself in any room that mattered. That is not weakness finally showing its face. That is information. Fracture, the breakdown, the moment where the performance finally became unsustainable and something raw and unmanaged pushed through the surface. That was not the worst thing that ever happened to you. That was the first honest thing to happen to you in a very long time. That was the part of you that refused the final installment, that looked at what was being asked and said quietly, with absolute finality, "Not this. Not anymore." One more piece. Approval is the most elegant prison ever designed because it doesn't look like a prison. It looks like love. It looks like belonging. It looks like the warm, necessary feeling of being seen and accepted and valued by the people and systems around you. It arrives early, before you're old enough to question it, before you have any framework for understanding what's being exchanged. And it teaches you the most fundamental lesson you will spend the rest of your life, either obeying or unlearning. Be what we need you to be, and you will be safe. And safety, when you are small and the world is large and uncertain, is everything. You don't negotiate with everything. You don't examine it or interrogate its terms or ask what it's going to cost you 15 years from now, when you've built an entire identity around its conditions. Take it gratefully, because the alternative, disapproval, withdrawal, the cold, specific silence of people who have decided you are too much or not enough, feels like annihilation when you're young enough that other people's perception of you is the only mirror you have. Okay? So you learned the rules, not the spoken rules. Anyone can follow spoken rules. They're clean, explicit, easy to navigate. You learned the unspoken ones, the ones that lived in facial expressions and tones of voice and the barely perceptible shift in atmosphere when you said something too honest or wanted something too openly or took up more space than the situation had silently allocated for you. You became fluent in the language of what was acceptable. You developed a sensitivity so finely tuned that you could feel the edges of your permitted self without ever being told explicitly where they were. And you stayed inside them because the approval kept coming when you did. The warmth, the inclusion, the sense of mattering to people who you needed to matter to, all of it remained available as long as you remained manageable, as long as your needs were modest and your opinions were palatable and your ambitions didn't make anyone around. You have to confront the distance between where they were and where they could have gone if they'd been braver. That is what they never told you about approval seeking. It's not just about you shrinking. It's about making the people granting the approval comfortable with their own limitations. A person who fully inhabits themselves, who pursues what they actually want with the full force of who they actually are, is deeply threatening to everyone around them who has made peace with their own cage. Your contentment with less was never just convenient for the system. It was necessary for the psychology of everyone who had already chosen less and needed that choice to feel like wisdom rather than surrender. Yet your hunger, as your refusal to pretend that what was on offer was enough, made them uncomfortable in ways they couldn't always name but could always feel. And discomfort in people who have built their entire interior lives around avoiding it produces a very specific response. They don't examine the discomfort. They don't ask what it's telling them about themselves. They locate it in you. They make your aliveness the problem. They dress it up in the language of concern. You're being unrealistic. You're being difficult. You need to be more grateful, more grounded, more reasonable. And they deliver it with the practiced conviction of people who genuinely believe they are helping. But what they are actually doing is protecting their investment. The investment of years spent conforming, the investment of desires deferred and voices lowered, and authentic selves quietly folded away into something that could pass through the world without causing friction. They need you to make the same investment because your refusal to do so raises a question they have spent enormous energy avoiding. What if I didn't have to? The day you stop needing their answer to that question is the day everything changed. Not loudly, not with any dramatic declaration or visible rupture, just a quiet internal shift. The moment the approval stopped feeling like oxygen and started feeling like a leash. The moment you realized that the warmth they were offering was always conditional, and conditions are just the architecture of control, wearing a friendlier face. And a person who has seen the leash, who has felt its full length, who has stood at the exact point where it goes taut, and felt what it feels like to want to keep walking anyway, that person cannot be called back with the same tricks that worked before. They needed a word for it. That's the first thing you have to understand. When something exists that a system cannot categorize, cannot contain, cannot redirect into something useful and productive and unthreatening, the system does not attempt to understand it. Understanding requires the admission that perhaps the thing being observed has an interior logic that the observer hasn't grasped yet. And humility is not a quality that power cultivates in itself, because power that admits gaps in its understanding begins to look like something that could be questioned. So they named it instead. They called it madness. They called it instability. They called it a disorder, a dysfunction, a dangerous departure from the norm that needed to be treated and managed. And ideally returned to something resembling the baseline of a person who causes no complications. They built entire institutions around the project of taking the people who saw things differently. Who felt things at volumes the average person had been successfully trained to suppress, who asked questions the architecture of ordinary life was not designed to survive, and reintroducing them to conformity through whatever means the era made available. Because the era always made means available. Right? And here is the thing about naming something madness. The thing they understood intuitively, even when they couldn't have articulated it as strategy. Once you've successfully labeled a person's perception as symptomatic, you don't have to engage with what they're perceiving. The label does the work. It preemptively discredits everything that comes out of that person's mouth, every observation they make, every pattern they identify, every uncomfortable truth they drag into the light. You don't have to argue with the content. You just gesture at the diagnosis and let the audience draw its own conclusions. It is the cleanest form of silencing ever invented because it doesn't look like silencing. It looks like concern. It looks like a society caring for its most vulnerable members, providing support for the people who are struggling, building frameworks to help those who have lost their way find their way, but back to wellness and functionality and productive participation in the common project. The language is soft. The language is therapeutic. The language has been so thoroughly sanitized of its actual intent that even the people administering it have often forgotten or never knew that what they are maintaining is not health but compliance. And you felt that, not necessarily in those exact words, but in the experience of bringing your actual self, your actual perceptions, your actual conclusions about what was happening around you and why, into spaces that were supposed to be safe, and watching those perceptions get quietly, professionally, kindly redirected back to something more manageable. You learned that certain thoughts had acceptable forms and unacceptable forms, that the same observation, depending on how settled and unthreatening you appeared while delivering it, would either be engaged with or referred to someone who could help you process whatever you were clearly going through. The content never mattered as much as the presentation, which meant the real training was never about what you thought. It was about how you carried yourself while thinking it, how little disruption you caused to the surrounding atmosphere, how successfully you internalized the rules of the room so that even your most radical perceptions arrived pre-domesticated, already stripped of the energy that made them true. But freedom, real freedom, the kind that doesn't ask permission and doesn't arrive pre-domesticated, has never been comfortable to witness. It has always looked, to eyes trained on the manageable and the expected, like something has gone wrong, because freedom of that depth doesn't perform wellness for an audience. It doesn't modulate itself to remain legible to people who have never left the territory of the permitted. It exists at a frequency that the conventionally adjusted human nervous system registers not as liberation, but as threat. And threat, in a system designed to protect itself, gets the same response it always gets: a label, a category, a word that puts walls around the thing without ever having to look directly at what the thing actually is. They called it madness because language is the first line of containment. Because if they had called it what it actually was, if they had looked at the people who refused the cage and named what they were seeing accurately, they would have had to call it courage. And courage, in sufficient quantities, freely named and openly recognized, is the one thing no system of control has ever found a reliable method to survive.